What's up, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. Welcome back to another episode. If this is your first time tuning in, then thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and continue to tune in the future. Today, we're going to be talking about strength training, specifically for endurance athletes. So this is I would say a relatively newer concept to the field of endurance training. A couple decades ago, strength training wasn't quite as pervasive or prevalent amongst endurance athletes as it is today. But you'd be pretty hard pressed today to find, especially at the elite level and the professional level, endurance athletes that don't partake in strength training. But 2-3 decades ago, that wasn't really the case. Endurance athletes tended to focus primarily on building their endurance through whatever their sport was, whether it was swimming, cycling, running. Their training mostly consisted of swimming, cycling, running, without much thought of strength training. It was typically thought of that strength training and plyometrics and power-based training was reserved for more of the strength and power and team-based athletes. So obviously, like powerlifters and Olympic weightlifters, they need to lift weights because that's what their performance is in lifting the most amount of weight as possible. Team sport athletes like football players, baseball players, so on and so forth. It was pretty well accepted even a few decades ago that strength training was important and a really integral part of their training plan. But for endurance athletes, not so much. It's a relatively newer concept to be incorporating strength training into one's training plan. And just like the demands of an endurance athlete are different than the demands of a team sport athlete or a strength and power-based athlete, the strength training that an endurance athlete does or engages in needs to match the demands of the sport that they're doing. And so I'm obviously going to be covering strength training and how it applies to endurance athletes and what types of strength training endurance athletes usually want to focus on and what the benefits of strength training are. And for team and power sport athletes, it's going to look a lot different, the type of strength training program that they engage in compared to an endurance athlete. So that's why you have to kind of think about strength training in terms of the specific type of athlete or sport that you're doing or that your athlete that you're working with is doing. So this episode is going to be really useful not only for endurance athletes themselves, whether you're self-coached or whether you're an endurance athlete and you have a coach. This episode is going to be really good in illuminating some of the very basic benefits of strength training specifically for you as an endurance athlete, and then as well as some of the practical applications of that strength training and how you can begin to apply strength training to your routine. But also coaches as well. This will be really useful for you and the athletes that you work with in giving you a better understanding of what the premise behind strength training for endurance athletes is, what the benefits are, and then again, what those practical applications are. So strength training I'm going to say the word strength training, and it's going to be pretty much an umbrella term that covers a variety of different types of resistance and power-based training. But when we talk about strength training in this podcast, think of it as a combination of different types of resistance-based exercises that you might do with bands or dumbbells or barbells or machines, as well as plyometric and power-based training. So there's also there's not only just like weight-based training that you do by adding resistance in the form of bands, bars, dumbbells, machines, etc., but there's also like plyometrics and power-based exercises in which the goal is to generate force really rapidly. And I'm going to talk about some of the differences between like traditional like resistance-based exercises and plyometric-based exercises. But when I say strength training, just think of all of those things together. I'm going to use strength training as like an umbrella term that captures all those different types of variations and approaches to strength training. So when we think of the endurance athlete, we know through decades of research that there are three major variables that show up in the research literature that are related to or associated with improved endurance performance. So we have our VO2 max, or our maximal aerobic power, our lactate or anaerobic threshold, and then exercise economy or movement economy, or exercise efficiency is another term for it. So those are the big three. And I mention this because we have to understand some of the physiological variables that are associated with improved or better endurance performance so that we can then understand where strength training fits into an endurance athlete's training plan. So when it comes to VO2 max is one of the classic variables that's associated with improved performance. So obviously, as your ability to take in and utilize oxygen goes up, which is your VO2 max, the better your endurance performance is going to be. So those athletes with a higher VO2 max tend to perform better in endurance sport than those with a lower VO2 max. Lactate threshold is another variable that's very much so associated with improved endurance performance. So this is essentially the maximal pace, power output, or intensity that you can sustain for about an hour. If you go above your lactate threshold, fatigue ensues pretty quickly because of the accumulation of lactate, which is really associated with the accumulation of hydrogen ions in the body. And it's the accumulation of hydrogen ions in the body that really leads to fatigue. But lactate is kind of the marker that we use as opposed to measuring hydrogen ion concentration. So lactate threshold is also associated with improved endurance performance. The higher one's lactate threshold, the higher pace or intensity or power output they can maintain before getting fatigued. So obviously the higher one's lactate threshold, the better they're going to perform in endurance sport. And then exercise economy or exercise efficiency is the third big variable that we see that's associated with improved endurance performance. So think of exercise economy or exercise efficiency as essentially that, your efficiency, how efficient you are at moving through space and time. So for example, let's say we have a runner, and let's say they run, let's say we have two runners. So we have one runner that's running at, or actually let's say both of them are running at a 7.5 minute per mile pace. We can look at both of those runners, and let's say they have the same VO2 max and the exact same lactate threshold. Well, who's going to perform better? The runner who's more economical or more efficient at running at that pace. So if the goal was to run as far as they can at a 7.5 minute mile pace, the runner who's more economical is probably going to go further because they're going to be accumulating less fatigue while running at that 7.5 minute mile pace than the other athlete. Another way to think about this would be, let's say we have two runners that are running a marathon. Let's say they have the exact same VO2 max, and then let's say they have the exact same lactate threshold. So they're pretty much identical athletes in that sense. Now, who's going to win out in the marathon? Now, obviously, there's some psychology and some mental factors that come into play here. But let's just say all that stuff, for the sake of this situation, is the same. Who's going to win out? The one who's more economical or efficient is going to win out because they can run at a faster pace or the same pace as the athlete next to them, while again accumulating less fatigue because they're demanding less energy to run at that given pace that's going to beat the other athlete. So essentially, the more efficient you are and economical you are, the better you're going to perform. So again, those three big factors, VO2 max, lactate threshold, and exercise economy or efficiency, are very much so associated with improved endurance performance. Now, VO2 max and lactate threshold are very much so trained through your kind of traditional approach to endurance training. So if you're a runner, you can improve your VO2 max and your lactate threshold through running. Now, you can also improve your exercise economy through running. And so just by running more, you're going to become more economical because what you do frequently, the body becomes used to, it becomes adapted at doing. And then there's other ways, of course, of improving your exercise economy and efficiency through training other than just running more frequently. But all three of those variables are trainable through doing just your kind of standard endurance training. So whether you're a cyclist, a runner, or a swimmer, or whatever your endurance sport is, just training appropriately by doing the sport that you participate in is going to improve those three factors. Now, where strength training really comes in is when it comes to the exercise economy or efficiency piece. So strength training, especially when done appropriately, doesn't necessarily have too much of an impact on one's VO2 max. That's best trained through doing endurance activity. Same thing with lactate threshold. That isn't necessarily affected by doing strength training, but where an appropriately designed strength training program comes into play for the endurance athlete is by improving their economy and their efficiency. So there are obviously also other benefits to strength training as well. Some of those would be, we do tend to see, depending on the research you're looking at, that there might be a potential for the reduced risk of overuse injuries. And this could be just from improving muscular imbalances that an athlete might have across joints. It could be just improving the overall strength and resiliency of not only the muscle tissue, but also the tendons. So a lot of overuse injuries tend to pop up in the tendon or the ligaments, but particularly the tendons. And so just strengthening the muscle tissue and the tendon tissue itself through strength training and improving its resiliency and its overall strength and integrity could potentially reduce the likelihood of overuse injuries. And so obviously that's of importance to the endurance athlete, because overuse injury tends to be something that a lot of endurance athletes will struggle with at some point in their endurance athletic career, especially athletes that are participating in endurance sport for a long period of time. So just that basic benefit of reducing the likelihood of injury could be a really big one when it comes to strength training. So that's one benefit. But when it comes to actually improving endurance performance itself, exercise economy or efficiency is really where the benefits start to come into play. Again, the strength training program has to be programmed or approached in a specific way in order to get those benefits, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second. But first, let's talk about how strength training improves muscular efficiency or movement economy. So strength training, when done appropriately, is going to, one, hopefully over time improve the maximal strength of the athlete. So let's say the maximal strength of an athlete in terms of, let's say, their 1 repetition maximum squat is 300 pounds. And then let's say that endurance athlete engages in strength training and they improve their 1 rep max squat to 350 pounds. Well, now their leg musculature can produce more force. It has a greater ceiling of the maximal amount of force that it can produce. So endurance sport and endurance activity is a very sub-maximal activity. So when an athlete is running or cycling, they're doing so obviously depending on the intensity that they're working at. But for the most part, if they're doing a race of some sort or they're doing a training session, it's a very sub-maximal activity. They're not just running as hard as they can for like 3 seconds and doing a maximal effort for 3 seconds. They're doing it for minutes and hours at a time, so it has to be very sub-maximal. So if they have a greater maximal strength, that activity that they're doing is going to be done at a lower percentage of their maximal strength or their ceiling. So in theory, it should make their usual kind of training intensity or racing intensity feel a little bit easier because they have a greater ceiling of strength to work with. So when they're running, say, for like a 2-hour training run, if their maximal strength goes up and they run at that same pace that they used to run at for their 2-hour endurance run, every time their muscles contract, they're contracting at a lower percentage of their theoretical maximum strength. So in theory, that should make it easier, and they should be more efficient and economical at that given pace. The other really big way that it improves efficiency and economy is through increasing the tendon stiffness of the muscles. So you have to think of your tendons as like the rubber bands that connects the muscle to the bone. And so every single time you produce force through muscle contraction, that force is translated or transmitted through the tendon to the bone so that it can move the bone. And now the stiffer the tendon or the stiffer the rubber band, the more force or power gets translated to the bone. So a good example of this would be something that's really popular nowadays is a carbon-plated running shoe. So the main reason why they do that is to reduce the amount of energy that's lost when the foot hits the ground and you're transferring energy from the muscle to the tendon to the ground. So if you have a stiffer tendon or a stiffer shoe in the form of adding a carbon plate to that shoe, there's going to be less energy loss when you're transmitting that force or that power from the muscle to the tendon to the ground. So tendons are kind of similar in the sense that they act essentially as like the connection between the muscle and the bone. So again, the stiffer that tendon, the more energy or power or force is going to be transmitted to the bone. And so there's just going to be less energy loss or less power loss, which essentially means that you're more efficient. So those are really the two big ways in which strength training affects exercise economy or exercise or movement efficiency. But again, it depends on the type of strength training that you do. So now we're going to get into talking about the specific approach to strength training that an endurance athlete ideally wants to have in order to improve overall muscular efficiency or movement economy. And so this is where the approach that the endurance athlete takes with their strength training is very, very important. So typically when a coach or a strength and conditioning coach programs strength training into an athlete's routine, they typically think of, first of all, the types of exercises that the athlete is going to be doing, and then the loading that athlete is going to experience. And then that loading dictates the number of sets and repetitions and the rest period between each set that the athlete is going to experience. So on the spectrum of resistance training, we have very light loading at a low percentage of an athlete's 1 repetition maximum, with a high number of repetitions and a short rest period between sets. And that type of approach with strength training typically improves muscular endurance, which is great, especially for athletes that are new to strength training or that are just starting with a strength training program and they've never done it before. That's typically where most beginner or novice athletes are going to start, is kind of on that endurance focused spectrum of resistance training. But endurance athletes are already improving their muscular endurance by just engaging in the sport that they participate in. So a cyclist is improving their muscular endurance by just doing their normal cycling training. So by spending all of their time focused on light loads with high repetition ranges, they're not really going to get very much additional benefit from that outside of like initially improving their strength a little bit if they're brand new to strength training. But beyond that, they're just focusing on improving muscular endurance, which they're already doing by doing their sport. So typically what we do is we want to, especially for the endurance athlete, we get them to kind of build their base, so to speak, by focusing more on building muscular endurance and getting their movement proficiency down by learning the new movements and doing them correctly. And then eventually we try and get them to progress towards improving muscular strength and muscular power, which is at the other end of the spectrum. And that's where most of the benefits come, specifically for endurance athletes, in improving their movement efficiency and muscular economy. So now in order to best target improvements in muscular strength or maximal strength, we typically need heavy loads, so that's at a high percentage of their 1 repetition maximum. And then very low repetitions with a lot of rest in between each set. And so typically with this, let's say the athlete is doing a squat exercise, they might do squats, or let's say it's a barbell back squat, for 3 to 4 sets of maybe 5 to 6 reps with a couple minutes of rest in between each set. So that's a very strength-focused approach to strength training. And so that type of approach, when done over time, is going to best promote improvements in muscular strength. And remember, improving their maximal strength or their muscular strength has a benefit on movement economy, because the higher their muscular strength is, the lower percentage of their theoretical maximal muscle strength they're going to be operating at when doing their normal endurance sport activity, whether it's training or racing. So the higher they can get their maximal strength, the better, typically with endurance athletes, because that's just going to make them more efficient at submaximal exercise intensities. And so in addition to focusing on muscular strength, we also want to, for the endurance athlete, have a focus on building muscular power, which might seem kind of counterintuitive, because you would think endurance athletes don't necessarily need to develop their ability to generate power, which is generating force really rapidly. That's essentially what power is. But it actually has a pretty good effect on improving movement economy and muscular efficiency over time. And so typically we focus on building power through doing things such as plyometrics, or really explosive kind of Olympic lift movements like barbell power cleans and push presses, things of that nature. And now focusing on developing the athlete's ability to generate power improves their economy during endurance activity in a few different ways. So one, it improves the stiffness of the tendon, kind of like how focusing on maximal strength by doing really heavy strength training exercises does. And improving the stiffness of that tendon, again, allows a better transfer of power and energy from the muscle to the bone. But then also focusing on developing muscular power impacts the athlete's ability to generate force via the elastic qualities of their muscle. And this is kind of what's known as the stretch shortening cycle capacity of the muscle. And so essentially the stretch shortening cycle, I'll give you an example so that you can imagine what the stretch shortening cycle is, but it's essentially a rapid eccentric contraction followed by a rapid concentric contraction, to make it really simple. And so running is usually the example I like to give for endurance athletes because it makes it really simple to kind of picture. So if you think of a runner, when their foot hits the ground, their muscles are contracting, but they're lengthening, which means that they're stretching out as their foot hits the ground. So that's what's known as the eccentric contraction of the stretch shortening cycle. And so during that period of time when the muscles are being lengthened under load, they're almost acting like rubber bands in the sense that they're storing potential energy, and then that potential energy is realized when they transition to pushing off from the ground and their muscles contract while shortening, which is known as the concentric phase of the stretch shortening cycle. And then in between those two phases, we have what's known as the amortization phase, which is essentially just the period of time between the concentric and the eccentric, or the eccentric and the concentric phase. And that phase is really important because that's where some of that potential energy can be lost in the form of heat dissipation. And by focusing on developing the power characteristics of an athlete, you're essentially improving that entire cycle or that entire process. You're improving the athlete's ability to not lose as much of that potential energy in the form of heat dissipation, because you're improving the elastic qualities of the muscle, and the athlete gets better at essentially generating power and force via the elastic qualities of the muscle, which doesn't require additional energy, right? It's almost like they're improving the elastic band properties of their tendons and muscle. So by focusing on developing an athlete's power, it can potentially make them more efficient during endurance exercise, particularly during running, because running actually involves the utilization of the stretch shortening cycle a lot more so than a sport like cycling or swimming, where those sports pretty much only rely on concentric muscle contractions. So it has a larger effect we tend to see in the research on runners, because they tend to rely on the stretch shortening cycle with every single running stride they take. But by improving the power capacity of an athlete, they essentially improve their ability to generate power and forward momentum via the elastic qualities of the muscle, which in turn makes them more efficient because they don't have to utilize more energy to generate power. They're just relying more on the elastic band characteristics of the musculature. So that's really where athletes get the most benefit from strength training, is by focusing on developing maximal strength, which comes from doing really heavy strength training exercises at low repetition ranges, and then trying to develop muscular power through the use of plyometric-based exercises or power-based exercises. And that typically comes from using lighter loads, but still really few repetitions. And the reason we typically do really few repetitions, it's usually less than 6 repetitions, kind of similar to when we're focusing on building muscular strength, is because when trying to develop muscular power, the quality and speed of movement is really, really important. So you want to be doing the power-based movements, whether it's a plyometric movement with your body weight or whether it's like an Olympic-style barbell movement. The speed and quality of the movement matters, because that's what elicits that stretch shortening cycle to the greatest capacity. And that's what we want to improve, is essentially their stretch shortening cycle capacity, which is their ability to utilize elastic energy for forward propulsion or to generate power. So focusing on strength and power is really where we want to eventually get the endurance athletes to focus. And again, like I said, all of this depends on the experience level of an athlete. So obviously, if you're a coach, you're going to start by introducing them to strength training with a lot higher repetition ranges and lower loads, getting them to kind of develop their base of muscular endurance and getting them to learn the different movement patterns of the strength training exercises that they're going to be doing. And then eventually over time, you might progress them to focusing on strength and power. And then for the athletes out there that are self-coached, you wouldn't want to just jump into doing strength training that focuses on developing maximal strength and muscle power right away. You would again want to focus more on building the basics by doing higher repetition ranges, and making sure that you're doing the movements correctly and learning the different types of movements. And then over time, again, you would progress towards developing muscular strength and muscular power. And then it's going to be a little bit too complicated for me to touch on all of the kind of different programming aspects of strength training in just this one podcast episode. But again, just like an endurance training plan is periodized in a certain way throughout the year, strength training is also periodized as well throughout the year. So you're going to have build phases of the strength training where you're maybe doing more strength training with more frequency or more volume. And then during like recovery weeks or down periods, you're going to reduce the volume or the intensity of that strength training, just like you would with endurance training. And so strength training is also periodized throughout the year as well around the athlete's kind of race calendar and their goals. I'll be sure to link into the show notes below a couple of links to some pieces that I wrote in our VO2 Max forum, which covers a lot of what I'm talking about today. There's 2 links. I pretty much broke up my discussion of strength training for endurance athletes into 2 parts: the science, which is part 1, and then the application of that, which is part 2. So I'll be sure to link those 2 articles into the show notes below so you can read a little bit more about what I talked about today. I just covered a lot of the kind of surface level aspects of strength training, some of the science behind it, and then some of the very, very basic applications of that science to strength training for endurance athletes, to get just a little bit more of an in-depth overview of the science and then the application. Go ahead and click on those links. You'll get a lot more information from reading through those 2 articles than you probably get from just this podcast. This episode is kind of just giving a brief but basic overview of some of the basics. And so, yeah, hopefully this podcast episode was useful for you, whether you're an athlete or a coach. And again, the goal with this is just to give a basic understanding of some of the science behind strength training, as well as how we apply that science of strength training specifically for endurance athletes. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, strength training needs to be tailored for the athlete and the sport that athlete is participating in. So a strength training routine for an endurance athlete should look a lot different than a strength training plan for, say, like a football player or a baseball player, or like a power lifter or an Olympic weightlifter. It's all going to look different, and it all needs to be tailored to the athlete, their experience level, their needs and their goals, and then obviously the competitions that they're pursuing. So if you have any questions on any of this stuff, you can always shoot me an email. I'll be sure to link that into the show notes below. You can also reach out via our website, which is peakenduranceSolutions.com, but I'll also be sure to link that into the show notes below as well. And again, hopefully you got something out of this episode, whether you are a coach or an athlete. And I'm looking forward to you guys joining us again for our next episode. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you liked what you heard in today's episode, please feel free to leave us a review. Those reviews are greatly appreciated and help spread the word about our podcast, as well as help us improve the content that we deliver to our listeners. And then finally, if you know of anyone who would be interested in listening to our podcast, please go ahead and share our podcast with them.